Some years ago, I was doing a project for a pharmaceutical company that was interested in understanding what was involved in a government listing drugs on the formulary, which is the list of approved drugs in a particular province. And the person I was interviewing was the head of a provincial formulary and responsible for a lot of these decisions about listing. So what we were interested in was not just the criteria and the rational factors that went into the decision to place a drug on a formulary, but a lot of the emotional aspects of it. So as I went into the interview, I began asking questions, not just about the science, but about the emotional side of things. And I got a very, very frosty reception from this individual. And about 15 minutes into the interview, she asked, "Well, what is this line of questioning? Why are you asking me all these things?" It was a difficult moment, and I pivoted and changed the interview to much more rational factors. But the point of the story is that in interviewing, you're going to come up against things that you don't expect. This is something I might have expected, that a scientist at a very senior level was not going to be prepared to acknowledge that emotional factors entered into this decision. I might have changed my interview strategy to uncover those in a more subtle way. So it's a bit of a comment that we're always learning as we go into this, and every interview that you do is a learning experience. And if you look at it that way and recognize that you don't have to get it perfect all the time, then I think that's a very good starting point, a very good frame to have as you go into the interviewing process. So we're going to talk in this lecture about some basic questions that you need to think about in planning and executing interviews. And very simply, what, who, where, when, and how. What kinds of interview, what kind of things should you ask, what should you be remembering, who's going to do the interviewing, where, what time, and some of the actual details. So this is very much a how-to session in conducting this kind of interviewing. So let's begin with some of the what, and here's some of the types. There are essentially 5 types of interview that at least I can think of. One is the purely structured one, which is much more of a quantitative research thing. It's not really a qualitative, but you're essentially asking the respondent the same series of questions. Now, you do that if you want to compare the responses across respondents. So in qualitative research, it has a role too. Semi-structured it's basically a formal interview. You actually arrange it, you pre-arrange it. You are doing an interview, but you've got a flexible set of questions. You can ask questions that are not in the plan. You can skip questions. You can do them in a different order. Unstructured interviews then are where you actually arrange an interview. It is an interview, but you don't really have set topics. So it's much more of a fishing expedition, and you just let it go where it goes. Informal interviewing is not necessarily arranging an interview, but just talking with people in the field informally without much of an interview guide. You might just sort of go up to people in a bar or a cafe and just ask them about stuff. That's an informal interview. Focus groups, I'm sure you've heard of. That is where you have small groups. Usually there are less than 10 respondents, and they tend to be semi-structured. That's the usual way that focus groups are done. And where you benefit there is in the interaction between the people in the group, and sometimes that's a downside as much as an upside. And then dyads, and that's interviewing people in pairs, and they could be buyers and sellers, for example, or couples. So that's where you're looking again at the sort of relational things that are going on between them. So what should you ask? What shouldn't you ask? Well, certainly for semi-structured interviews, and that's what I'm going to be talking about from now on for this lecture. Have your topics ready. Have a discussion guide. Have your topics ready, but don't go in with precise word-for-word questions. In other words, don't script things. you can be flexible also about the order to discuss things, because as your respondent starts to talk about things, if you give them the freedom, they're going to migrate into areas that you thought, oh, well, I was going to ask that later, but just let them run with it, and then you can skip that question later. Try to get deeper information as you go. So get them to tell you more. Why do they do that, right? Just constantly asking why without being a pain in the neck, but constantly asking why is a good strategy. Always be curious, look for what you don't expect to hear, so things that surprise you. I wouldn't generally ask personal questions of a respondent, or intimate questions, but they may go there. And so you can allow them to go there if they want, and all you've got to do is just ask, why, tell me more, the usual questions, but doing that sensitively. Importantly, don't evaluate. So don't make any judgments about what you're hearing. That's not your job. And if you do, the risk is that you'll get the respondent will actually shut down, and they won't give you any further information. So discussion guides. Well, there's a standard method for doing a discussion guide, and it's essentially known as the funnel, where you start broad, and then you narrow down. I sometimes like to do a reverse funnel, where I start specific, because then I can get specific stories about an instance, and then broaden out. You should keep it contextual, not speculative. In other words, you're asking about your opinion, the respondent's opinion, or their experience, but not maybe other people do this or anything like that. You're not interested in that. You're interested in their experience. When you can, try to get them to show you, right? Show me how you do that, right? So you're interviewing somebody about fixing up his motorbike, then can you just show me what you do here? That's usually very revealing when they do it. Uncover mental models. If you're doing a website, if you clicked over there, what do you think would happen if you're looking at a prototype, right? So you can get them to sort of move around. Asking open questions is very important. A lot of respondents you'll find they don't naturally go towards storytelling, and it is stories that you want. So getting them to talk, but not giving them questions they can easily answer yes or no, or whatever. How many times did you take the bus last week? Well, they might have they might say, well, 5 times, because I went to work on 5 days, or whatever. So try not to have questions that can be answered with yes or no, or a number, or whatever. You don't lead. You don't lead the respondent in their answer, although your answer or your question may lead them in a direction, and that's fine if it's the direction you want to go. But what you're not doing is supplying them with hints at the answer, or what you might think acceptable. And remember also, when I say don't outsource your design to the participant, you are interested in their point of view, genuinely interested in their context. What you're not asking them to do is, what do you need? What do you want? Because you'll get useless answers to that, because in this day and age, people don't need or want a lot of things, at least in this part of the world. It's important to use all your senses, right? So interviewing is not just a verbal thing, but you're watching for body language, you're smelling for the scent in the environment, right? Maybe you're working with them, you're in an immersion, and you might be tasting some food or whatever. So being hyper aware of everything that's going on around you while being focused on the respondent it's a challenge, but it's an important one to keep in mind. As for the interviewer, who should be doing the interview? Well, ideally, if it's someone like the respondent, so that they can identify with them, and that'll encourage them to come out with more open and honest information. It can be critical if you're looking at very sensitive personal issues, which happens a lot. Then it may stand or fall on whether you are the same or similar to the interview. So, for example, if you're asking women about, for instance, their relationships, their marriage, it probably usually wouldn't be a good idea for a man to do that. You'd rather have a woman do that, so you'll get more frank information as a result. Another thing you need is not just to be able to listen, but to be comfortable with silence, and that's hard for many of us. So that is where you just allow silence to sit and allow the respondent to fill the silence. Some people are more comfortable with that than others, and you can certainly train yourself to be comfortable with silence. But I would look for people who are inherently okay with it. Where are you going to do the interviewing? The rule is always in context or as close to in context as you can. And the context can be, if they're looking for stuff, searching online, then you're going to maybe accompany them in the search. Maybe it's where they buy something or experience it or consume it, where they actually dispose of it. If you're interested in something like recycling, go to a recycling depot with them. Or maybe it's parts of the experience. So you can chunk any experience down into enticement, entry, engagement, exit, and extension. And so that then you may decide, okay, for this particular interview, we're only interested in the enticement part. At another stage, we'll look at the entry or engagement or whatever, but you may use your interviews just to focus on different parts of that experience. Other things. Generally speaking, you should be, interviewing is not easy, and it requires a tremendous amount of focus. So minimizing any distractions to the extent that you can is really important. If you're going to interview in a bar, you've got to be prepared. There are going to be distractions, or actually a better example is if you're going to interview a parent at home with the kids, there are going to be distractions. And the question is, does interviewing in context, is it important enough to put up with the distractions or learn to manage them in some way? Turn your phone off. I would actually turn your phone off at airplane mode or do not disturb. You're not going to be checking emails. You don't want notifications popping up on the screen, which will distract you. Also think of your ability to hear the respondent and get a good quality recording. So for example, coffee shops, restaurants in particular are noisy places, and that's fine. I mean, if you've got a very soft-spoken respondent in a noisy restaurant, that can be really tough for you to hear, and even tougher for recording to pick up. So ideally, you should do it in a quiet place. Again, if you're in context, that may not be the right thing to do, and you're going to have to make a trade-off there. As much as you can, get the responsibility to show you things as well as tell them. For example, recycling. If you're talking about recycling, let's have a look in your recycling bin, your garbage bin, to see what actually is there, or what are you going to do with this bottle, and follow them through, etc. So when should you do this? Again, the rule is in context. If it's about breakfast, do it at breakfast time. It's usually best, I like to plan for a 1-hour interview, but very often, respondents don't have that kind of time. And so you have to pivot, you have to adjust. But generally speaking, don't close before the respondent is ready. If the respondent wants to carry on for an hour and a half, 2 hours, then that's fantastic. You get all that much more in-depth information. At the same time, you need to be sensitive to when they want to close. So you'll see them shuffling impatiently and that sort of stuff, and that may be a time to start to bring things to a close. If you think your interview is going to be cut short, and this happens a lot with executives or parents, indeed, right? Anyone who's busy, then try and get your most important questions in early, so that you don't end up being interrupted just before you're about to ask the big question. Try to set it up in a way that the respondent isn't rushed. That's why you have a trade-off. If you're doing something about families and kids, do you do that in the home? Or do you do it out of the home, where they're going to be, where parents, for instance, are going to be more relaxed? The other thing is that you may have to go back more than once just to maybe, if you've shown them one prototype, you might want to show them the next one, or for member checking, just to check, is this what you said, and so on. So it's a good idea in an interview just to ask if it's okay if you follow up later. Usually they'll say yes to that. How do you do this? Well, here's just some of the nitty gritty. So first of all, you need to introduce yourself. Sometimes you're doing interviews with a colleague, and so you'd introduce a colleague with you. What are we doing here? What are you trying to accomplish here? When do you expect to finish? How long do you expect the interview to be? You may have consent forms, in which case get them filled out at the beginning. And always, always, always ask permission if you're going to record. That's really important. Don't just switch on your phone to record things. Calm their nerves, right? Most respondents, this is a strange situation for them, and they very often they're asking the questions. The first question they have in their minds is, what does this person want? So calm their nerves. I usually tell them what I want. So just here's the project I'm working on. Distance yourself from the design. If you have a prototype, one guideline I had was just to kind of be very humble. Just say, nah, this is something I came up with, or you can toss it on the floor and kick it around. It's not, don't present your prototype or your design as, here's this wonderful thing I've come up with, what do you think? Because they're going to back off and want to say nice things, right? You don't want nice things, you want real things. So distance yourself from it. Tell them that you only care about their opinion, not, oh, here's what most people do, or generally, here's what happens, or, that sort of stuff. You're only interested in their opinion and their experience, right? So it's not most people go grocery shopping and do this. Here's what I do. Here's what I did last time. Reassure them at the very beginning that there's no right answer. There's no smart answer, that all you're interested in is just honest, open answers, and let them know that their opinion does count, that it will help shape the solution that you come up with. It's important to build rapport, and that you can do relatively quickly. A little bit of small talk goes a long way, just to ask them how they got there, how's their day been so far. But the important thing is to, as you do, listen to them, read their body language, read, for instance, what they're wearing, etc., and find something that makes them really passionate, right? So if you're interviewing somebody and they're wearing a hiking jacket, maybe they've come in from a hike, and so you can sort of say, oh, I see you're wearing a hiking jacket, you mean hiking or whatever. So find what it is, talk about it, get them to open up. And the time and the investment you spend in that, and it can be very quick, is repaid, because if they have a feeling of comfort with you, they will give you better information. In terms of just technique for getting the information, active listening, that's nodding, smiling, paraphrasing, making sure that they know that you're hearing what they say. Don't be distracted. This is kind of eyeball to eyeball. You want them to know that you're really intrigued and interested in what they say. At the same time, there's a lot going on here, because you're listening to the environment, you're hearing what goes on, you're watching body language, you're planning your next question. So there is a tremendous amount of focus required for this kind of interviewing. Look for physical cues, right? So do their gestures match their words, right? Is there additional information you can get from them that sheds light or makes you curious? Take your time, get your thoughts together, prepare your next question. Silence is great, because they'll fill silence a lot of the time. Keep it open, and you're just constantly curious. Tell me about that last time, what happened, who did it, why, that kind of thing. And you follow the respondent's flow. This is you follow what they seem to be interested in, and then eventually you'll ask your probing questions as you go. It's great to have a closing question that really encapsulates things. For a prototype you're showing, do you know someone else that you've told me what you think? Do you know someone else you might recommend this to, who is that? And the interesting bit is, why would you recommend that to that particular person? You know, because that'll give you another dimension of information. How would you rate it out of 10? And that can spin off into why is that? What would you tell the designers? Because you're not the designer, you're the researcher, as far as they're concerned. And try to summarize things, right? So you'd say that you know, this is a useful product, but you don't like the look of it, right? And so on. So you can summarize in that way. Always thank your respondent at the end of the interview. They're doing you a favor, and you should show your appreciation for that. Recording. As I mentioned earlier, you should ask permission before you record. Digital, I use digital all the time now. If it's appropriate, it's not always easy or appropriate to do. Capture it on video, and that'll help you see some of the body language that accompanies what the respondent is saying. You can do written notes. These days, I don't do a lot of written notes. You can do written notes. Just don't try and write down every word, because then you're going to be just focusing on your paper, not on the respondent. And don't just select what you think is important, write it down, because they're going to see that. Mostly it's kind of maintaining the eye contact and the engagement with your respondent. So just don't let the notes be a distraction. And then after or during every interview, just pick up any artifacts or things at the scene, like brochures, photos, sketches, things that the respondent has with them that remind them that seem special to them, and use those then as part of the data. Everything is data, okay? So you're interested in anything interesting or relevant in as close in direct quotes or as close to that as you can. That's why recording is great, right? And what I actually do is I upload the recordings to an AI website, which will transcribe them. It gives me really bad transcripts. It's always wrong, but at least it helps me to remember what was said, and I have the recording there too. Record what you smell, what you taste, what you feel. Everything is data. Record your design ideas, any questions you might have for the future that arise from the interview. Interviewing is very much about listening. So it's not about talking, and what you need to do is let the respondent fill any silences there are. Don't jump in and fill silences. As I mentioned a little earlier, it's often best to start with a specific instance of something and then broaden out. A lot of people start at a high level and and then they just get vague, abstract ideas. What you need are stories. And so when, if I ask, for instance, tell me about where you go grocery shopping, and they might say, oh, well, yeah, I usually go to Safeway, or I usually go to Loblaws, and so on. And you'll get very high level generalities, where you'll get a lot more out of saying, tell me about the last time you went grocery shopping. When was that? Oh yeah, I went last Friday. And where did you go? And I went to Safeway. But I usually go to Loblaws. But I want to tell me about Safeway, your experience there, and so on. And you can build out of that. You can get the stories, their interaction with the cashier, the products they bought, and so on, rather than just generalities. So I'm a big fan of this starting specific and going general, which is not the usual way people recommend to go about interviews. Respect is super important. Respect the respondent. They have their reality. What you're trying to do is to understand it. You're not trying to judge it. You just want to hear it, and you want to empathize with it to an extent, but mostly just to listen to it. So here's a few things for you to think about as you reflect on this lecture. Here, for example, say you were interviewing a young mother about her decision not to vaccinate her daughter. How would you open an interview like that, and where would you go from there? So that's an exercise in just playing around with the discussion guide, and you can do that with a partner or with your team. In what circumstances would you use semi-structured interviews as opposed to structured interviews? What about unstructured interviews? And then finally, what would you do if an interview says she recycles everything, but you see her throw her water bottle in the garbage? Would you say something or just make a note and move on? So we'll leave it there. That's all about interviewing. And the other part of ethnographic research is, of course, observation. And there's a separate lecture on that.